When Clara Morgan walked into her home that Thursday evening, she wasn't supposed to be there. Her business trip to Chicago had been cancelled at the last minute due to a storm, and she had decided not to call ahead, wanting to surprise her family with dinner and hugs after a long week apart. But what she found inside her house was something no mother should ever have to see. The lights were dim. The television in the living room murmured faintly, showing some old cartoon rerun. Clara dropped her keys onto the counter and called out, "Liam? Grace? Anyone home?" No answer. Then she heard the sound, soft, rhythmic, like scrubbing. She followed it into the kitchen. There, on her knees, was her 9-year-old daughter, Grace, wearing one of Clara's oversized t-shirts. The child was scrubbing the floor with a sponge, her little hands raw and red. Her face was wet, not from sweat, but from tears. Clara froze. "Grace, sweetheart, what are you doing?" The girl flinched at her mother's voice and turned around, startled. "Mum, you're home?" Her voice trembled. Clara's stomach twisted. Grace looked toward the door, as if expecting someone else to appear. When no one did, she whispered, "Grandma said the kitchen was dirty. She said if I wanted to eat dinner with them next time, I had to clean it properly." Clara's breath caught. "Where are they now?" Grace pointed toward the counter, where a note lay folded neatly beside a half-eaten sandwich. It read, "Took Lily to the fair. Don't wait up. Grace has chores to finish. She knows why. Lily." Brendan's daughter from his first marriage, the real granddaughter, as his mother liked to say, when she thought Clara wasn't listening. The note slipped from Clara's hands. She crouched beside Grace and lifted her chin gently. "How long have you been here alone?" Grace sniffled. "Since lunch. Grandma said I couldn't come because I don't behave like Lily. She said I have to learn manners before I can go anywhere fun." The words hit Clara like a punch to the chest. Her pulse quickened, but her face remained calm, a mask she'd learned to wear over years of biting her tongue for the sake of peace. She stood up slowly, looked around the kitchen, and took in the silent house. There were crumbs on the counter, Lily's shoes by the door, and a photo frame on the fridge, all of them grinning proudly. Grace wasn't in that picture. That was when Clara decided enough was enough. That night, after feeding Grace and tucking her into bed, Clara sat alone in the living room. The house smelled faintly of cleaning supplies and silence. She stared at her wedding photo on the mantel, her and Brendan smiling, arms around each other, full of hope. She remembered when they first met, how kind he'd seemed, how he'd praised her strength, her independence. He'd told her he admired how she balanced work and motherhood. But somewhere along the way, admiration had turned into resentment. After their marriage, Brendan's parents had become a constant presence, always visiting, always criticizing, always drawing subtle lines between their family and Clara's daughter. At first, Clara thought she was imagining it, but it became impossible to ignore the small things. How Grace's birthday was forgotten while Lily's was celebrated for a week, how Grace's school drawings disappeared from the fridge, how Brendan's mother called her Clara's girl, never our granddaughter. And Brendan never stopped them. Now, as she looked at her sleeping child, Clara realized that she'd been silent for too long. The next morning, Brendan came home with his parents and Lily, all cheerful and laughing from their day at the amusement park. "Oh, you're back early," he said, surprised to see her. "I am," Clara replied, her voice even. The conference was cancelled. His mother, Margaret, smiled politely. "Well, that's lovely. We had such a wonderful time yesterday. The girls behaved perfectly." Clara looked straight at her. No. One of them was left alone for hours as punishment. The conference was cancelled from the board. Ulf had spied as a character because of the small, blue, sweet smile. "Is that the word that you were?" "You heard me," Clara said. "You left my daughter alone in the house. She's 9, Margaret scoffed. "Oh, don't exaggerate." She needed to learn discipline. You spoil her. Clara felt a tremor rise in her chest but kept her tone cold and precise. You don't get to decide how my child is raised. Ever again. Brendan's face darkened. Clara, lower your voice. No, she said firmly. You knew how your mother treats Grace. You've watched it happen for years. But leaving her alone like that, that's neglect, and I won't let it happen again. His father muttered something about overreacting, and Lily stood awkwardly by the door, clutching her new stuffed bear. Grace peeked from the hallway, pale and silent. Clara turned to her daughter. Go upstairs, honey. I'll be right there. Grace obeyed without a word. When she was gone, Clara faced them all and said, I'll be contacting my lawyer on Monday. Margaret's laughter was sharp and cruel. Your lawyer. Don't be ridiculous. But Clara wasn't joking. Over the next week, Clara began documenting everything. Photos, messages, and Grace's quiet testimonies. The lawyer she met, Diane Keller, listened patiently and nodded. This isn't just emotional abuse, Diane said. This is negligence and intimidation. You have a case. But just as Clara prepared to file the report, Margaret struck first. 3 days later, 2 agents from Child Protective Services showed up at Clara's door. We received an anonymous complaint, one of them said. Someone alleged that your home environment may be unsafe for Grace. Clara's stomach dropped, but she kept her composure. I see. Please come in. They inspected everything. The bedrooms, the kitchen, the backyard. Grace clung to her mother's side the entire time. When they left, one of the agents quietly said, It's clear who's trying to manipulate this situation. Don't worry, just keep records of everything. That night, Clara cried, not out of fear, but exhaustion. The war she never wanted had begun. Weeks passed. Brendan moved into his parents' home temporarily, claiming he needed space. Clara didn't argue. Instead, she poured her energy into protecting Grace. The court case dragged on, filled with accusations and lies. Margaret painted Clara as unstable, obsessed, and controlling. But every time they spoke, every recorded call, every screenshot told a different story, one of cruelty masked as family concern. And through it all, Grace began to change. She smiled again. She laughed at silly movies. She started painting, something she'd stopped doing months before. One night, while Clara was putting her to bed, Grace whispered, Mom, are we safe now? Clara hugged her tightly. We're getting there, sweetheart. We're getting there. When the final hearing came, the courtroom was quiet, except for the hum of fluorescent lights. Brendan sat beside his parents, his eyes cold, his lawyer whispering strategy. Clara sat alone with Diane. Grace waited outside with a child advocate. Diane stood first. Your Honor, she began, this is a case not of shared misunderstanding, but of consistent emotional harm. The evidence shows repeated neglect, favoritism, and deliberate exclusion of a minor child. She handed over photos, text logs, witness statements, even a voicemail from Margaret saying, Grace isn't real family, she's just baggage. Brendan's lawyer objected, but the judge silenced him. When it was Brendan's turn to speak, he stumbled. I didn't realize how much it hurt Grace. I thought my mother was helping. Clara watched him, the man she once loved, now a stranger who had chosen silence over decency. The judge's decision was clear. Sole custody granted to Clara, restraining order against Margaret, and supervised visitation for Brendan until further review. Margaret gasped audibly. Brendan's head dropped. Clara closed her eyes in relief. It was over. The weeks after the verdict were quiet. The house felt different, lighter. Grace helped her paint the living room a pale yellow. They started small traditions, Saturday pancakes, bedtime stories, weekend walks with their dog. Sometimes Grace would still wake from nightmares, crying about being left again. But each time Clara held her close, whispering, You're home now. No one will ever hurt you again. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Grace said softly, Mum, I don't think Grandma liked me very much. Clara's eyes stung. That's because she didn't understand what love really is. Love isn't about control or rules. It's about safety, about kindness. Grace leaned her head on her mother's shoulder. Then I'm glad I have you. Clara smiled through her tears. Me too, baby. Months later, Clara received a letter from Brendan. He wrote that he was in therapy, that he regretted what had happened, and that he hoped to someday rebuild trust, not as a husband, but as a father. Clara didn't know how she felt reading it. The pain was still there, deep but fading. She decided not to reply, not yet. Healing wasn't about revenge or reconciliation, it was about peace. And peace, finally, was what she and Grace had found. The day Grace turned 10, Clara baked her favorite strawberry cake. As they sat together blowing out the candles, Grace grinned and said, "This is the best birthday ever." Clara looked at her, strong, resilient, free. "Yes," she whispered, "it really is."